I think it's important to realize that every day is precious, and how we live every day will give us extra life, and that how we live now really will echo into the future, and our future selves will thank us for how we live today. With education, you can make a massive difference. We actually have the instructions to be young again. It's possible to live at least 15 years longer. This is going to be the future, where someone who's in their 70s and 80s is still considered someone who's very hireable, who has a lot of wisdom, who can educate the young people. Medicine is basically putting Band-Aids on aging, but we're constantly getting cuts, and the doctor will put a Band-Aid on the cut and say, go home. And it's the reason why medicines typically don't help us. Even though aging is natural, why do we accept that? Natural is not an excuse to ignore it. There's no evidence for a biological limit to humans. I'm much more of an optimistic person now. I've seen that human ingenuity can solve just about any problem.
And you just said for every year you live, you get an extra 3 months of life. You just said that real quickly. What do you mean by that?
The increase in longevity because of medicine, technology, improvements in nutrition, where things get interesting and where we are with mice now, is that for every time period you stay alive, you get an extra time period. As Ray Kurzweil has said, we're going to reach a moment where for every year we live, we get another year of life. And we're not going to make it there if we just live the way big business wants us to live. We can't choose when we were born, but we can choose roughly when we're going to die. You realize that we are part of something much bigger than ourselves. And especially if we become financially stable and we have our health, then what's left? It's all about community, it's about education, our legacy. And I think a lot of us believe that leaving behind a human legacy, these people who will carry on what we haven't been able to fulfill in our own lives. I think many of us want to leave the world a better place than we found it. And if we don't achieve what we wanted to do in our lifetimes, the best way to do that is to leave behind those who can fulfill that.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. David Sinclair, the biologist, inventor, entrepreneur, and author. You are a professor in the Department of Genetics and co-director at the Center for Biology of Aging Research at Harvard Medical School. As one of the preeminent voices in the field of longevity, your work has been featured in 5 books and 2 documentary films, including Morgan Freeman's Through the Wormhole. You've received over 35 awards and are listed in Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World. Your groundbreaking book, Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, reveals the incredible breakthroughs and emerging technologies that can help all of us live longer, younger, and healthier. David, welcome to London Real.
Brian, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Great to be here too. You know, I want to kick it off with a quote from you where you say aging is a disease and that disease is treatable. When you tell people that for the first time, how often do you get these perplexed looks? Or are people becoming more hip to this concept that maybe we're not destined to just grow old fast?
Well, about 10 years ago when I said that for the first time, a lot of people were shocked. The problem is that we are raised to think that aging is something separate from diseases and that aging is natural, whereas diseases are not. But it's actually, it turns out aging is the cause of most of the diseases that we get, the root cause, 80% of the causes of cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's. And once you explain that, as I've been doing for now at least over a decade very publicly, more and more people are realizing that the current way we do medicine, which is to treat the end result of aging, is not as effective as what we're trying to do, and that is to slow down and reverse the aging process. But it is a psychological mind warp when people first hear it, that aging is a disease. And sometimes it's insulting to people. I don't have a disease, I'm healthy. But the truth is that we age from conception. We're all aging every day, and we can measure that now. But the good news is that it's increasingly preventable and treatable.
And certain countries kind of age faster than other countries, right? And I know in your book you kind of talk about like Russia versus Israel versus America, and they tend to rack up the years, sooner than later. Which kind of like top G20 countries are better or worse than others, and why typically is that?
Well, it's mostly lifestyle. We're all very similar genetically as a species. There are some good genes. The Japanese in general have some pretty good genes, longevity genes. But across humanity, there are lots of genes that people have. The difference that actually we've noticed is that about 80 to 90% of longevity and health into our 80s, 90s, and beyond is due to how we live our lives across the planet. And there are certain cultures that, for historical reasons mainly, have the type of lifestyles that turn on the body's defenses against aging. Now, we all know that if we exercise and move and eat less often and focus on plants, that tends to be associated with longer life, as well as lower stress and more sociable communities. These are all things that make us live longer. And there are pockets of that around the world. There's areas of Greece and Japan, US, Australia. These are countries that tend to have a healthier diet, more community, exercise more, partially because of the climate, partially maybe because they're working on farms. But generally, it's all about lifestyle. And one of the things I've been trying to do, besides my medical research and developing medicines to help people, is to say, all right, the medicines are coming, the pills are coming. Until then, we need to stay alive for longer. And how do you do that? It's make sure we at least try to mimic those cultures and get our bodies to fight aging rather than just deteriorate, which is what a lot of modern society is built on. Brian, one of the problems with the world that we have now, particularly in the West and even worse in the UK and the US, is that we like to be comfortable. And the markets have given us a very comfortable life, those of us who can afford it. And the problem is that switches off our body's defenses against aging. Not exercising, don't eat well, always being satisfied with the amount of food we have, never being hungry. That's the worst you can have, because our aging rate just accelerates with that kind of lifestyle.
Do most people look at you funny when you say, if you can be kind of starving, if you can be out of breath, if you can be cold, then you're going to live this long life? And people are probably looking at you and saying, well, 100 years ago, my grandparents were doing the same thing, or my great-grandparents, and they didn't live very long. Is it hard to get people's brain around that?
Well, it does appear to be a contradiction until you really dig in and find out that, yes, eating less often was good for you, and being cold can be good for you, and being hot, and not having as much food, being thinner, is generally good for you to a point. The problem with our great-grandparents and even grandparents was that then they were not doing it in a way that was conducive to longevity, in the sense that they didn't get the right nutrition, and they were also plagued by infections. And you look at the risks from 100 years ago. Childbirth was killing people, cancer was killing people, heart disease was rife because of the type of food, a lot of fat people were eating. But if you combine the adversity, or at least mimicking adversity, that they had in their lives with adequate nutrition and modern medicine, that is what we believe gives you the longest life. And the important thing is, a lot of these adversities don't have to be extreme. They can be a little bit of what doesn't kill you, makes you stronger and longer lived. We call this process hormesis. And it's not about feeling like you're going to die or that you're going to starve. It's about giving your body a few of those hints, a little bit of exercise, even just 5-10 minutes a day, a little bit of hunger, skip a meal each day and substitute with tea and coffee. These are the things that actually, over the long run, build up to give you maybe an extra 10, even 20 years of extra life.
David, I got to ask you a question. We're seeing these days, they're like, these real quests and cravings by parts of humanity for these extreme lifestyles. I've had Wim Hof on the show, who jumps in the ice baths and has the breathing. I've had David Goggins on here, who does these ultra marathons. And, we see people celebrating these extremes in life. I mean, do you think there's something deep down inside of us that is trying to tell us that we need to kind of push the limits of humanity while we're also trying to sit in business class and, drive in the Range Rover and all that stuff? Have you ever thought about that,
For sure. We as humans, we're not built for a comfortable lifestyle. Our bodies just fall apart if we give them too much of a good time. I call that the abundance mode. And I mentioned earlier the adversity mode. You've got to cycle between the two, because one is the abundance mode is build and repair, but the adversity is hunker down and survive. And if you don't have both of those, then you're just not going to slow down aging and live long. And I think there is an inbuilt desire for many of us to get back into more of that adversity mode. We feel better, we have more energy, we think better. And that's because what happens when you're in this adversity mode, at least for part of the day or part of the week, is that our bodies turn on these survival genes, some of which I study in my lab, called sirtuins. Without those, we become lethargic and our bodies have a much less metabolic activity, much less mental acuity. We put on weight, we don't feel as good. So I think what Wim Hof, Dave Goggins and others, what they're trying to do is get back to our evolutionary roots, where we spend at least part of the day turning on these survival genes that made us feel better, work better, live better, and even think better. And I also, what they often tell us is that if we live these lifestyles, we also psychologically feel better. We feel better about ourselves, but also the hormones and the molecules that are released in the brain make us more optimistic, make us happier, make us more alive. And that's also what I think drives those guys or those people and many of us to give some adversity have some adversity during the day.
And look, I want to jump into a lot of the ideas you have around diet, around exercise and cold and et cetera. But maybe quickly to look at what's actually happening with the genes, because I think you've said that only 20% of our longevity is genetically determined. And you talk about this concept of epigenetics and how we might have one set of genes, but actually getting those, I guess, copied over for new cells or getting those being able to be read efficiently or correctly is the problem we have as we age. And I think one of your old TED Talks, you really date yourself, is you talk about scratches in a CD, where, again, I'm dating myself because I know what a CD is. But maybe you can talk to people a little bit about how we can all start with the same DNA, but some people by the time they're 50 are actually replicating kind of more errored cells.
Yeah. So this is what I call the information theory of aging. Now, the old idea is that we just deteriorate, we get damaged cells, and we eventually die. The new idea is that we're more like computers, where we have software, and the software determines the function of the body. And because every cell has the same DNA, but different functions, each cell has to have a different type of software so that a brain cell works differently than a skin cell. And these software programs are written down as we're in the womb and then born. Over time, what we've discovered in my lab and others around the world is that what probably is a main driver of the aging process is that the software of cells gets corrupted, so that cells, even though they have the original hardware, the DNA, to function, the software that reads the DNA breaks down. And what we see, we have this big paper coming out in the scientific literature soon that actually is very good evidence that this is true, because we can take a mouse and we can corrupt the software and we can get it to age more rapidly, twice as fast. And then we've discovered there's a backup copy of the original software that we can reboot the system, and we can get that mouse to de-age, to reverse its aging process and become young again. We used this a couple of years ago, to reset the age of the eyeball in mice and get them to go from being blind in old age to being able to see again. And so it's very exciting that our bodies have this software that can be rebooted and reestablish youth in the same way that you might polish scratches off a CD to be able to play that music again. And what this actually means is that we're not just falling apart, we actually have the instructions to be young again. And now when I look at someone who's elderly, who's frail, who can barely walk, who might even still be bedridden, I look at that person as still being young. Their body just doesn't know how to read that youthful information. But one day it'll be possible, I'm certain, that we can give someone who's elderly a pill for, say, a couple of months and reverse their aging process so that they literally don't just feel young, they do become young again.
My grandparents were, farmers and cattlemen and cattlewomen in Arizona. And they grew up with these kind of hard working lives. But, they also, my grandpa and grandma, they kind of died of heart disease because they didn't really understand their diet. Of course, everybody was probably overeating then and over drinking and over smoking. I know you grew up near the outback, and you had a grandmother really that kind of brought you up, but also she aged, pretty rapidly. And I'm wondering, like you said, you look at older people today, and I'm wondering if you look at them and you're just thinking, wow, man, if I had been able to educate you 40 years ago, you could be thriving now as opposed to be in a nursing home. And I wonder if you ever think about that even from your own grandmother and your own mother. And I guess that's why you're working on having these supplements to reverse that process?
Yeah, well, I don't sell supplements, but I do work on medicines, and I do try to educate everybody on the planet as best I can reach them, to tell them that it's possible to live at least 15 years longer, I believe 25 years, 30 years longer, just by changing your lifestyle. And the earlier you start, the better. In your 20s, you can start this. And I do wish that I could have educated my grandmother and my mother, who both died fairly young, and or at least became sick young. My mother developed lung cancer in her 50s, and my grandmother became frail in her 70s. And the kind of lifestyle we're talking about is not that difficult. We can get into the details in a minute. But the point is that with education, you can make a massive difference. If you don't smoke, you don't become obese, you get enough sleep, you focus on plants, you don't overeat, you eat less often, skip a meal or two a day, a large meal that is. These things are enough. It's been shown scientifically by looking at tens of thousands of people. Very clearly, you can extend your lifespan by 15 years just by doing those simple things that most people know about already. Now, the kind of things that I add to are nuances on that, as well as, again, molecules and medicines that some are available right now. I believe we can take that 15 years and make it 25, 30. My father is a good example of someone who did get educated early on and took my advice. He's a scientist. He listens and can make his own judgments. He's now 83 years old. He has no diseases, no aches, no pains, and he's just as healthy, if not healthier, than he was in his 30s. He's stronger than me. I'm 53. And he's just loving life, and he's looking forward to another 20, 30 years to go. And when he was in his 60s, he thought that he'd probably be dead by 75, 80, which is the typical life course of a male who lives in Australia. But he's had to just change his attitude because he's just going on and on and on. And he's watching not only his wife, who died young, his peers, who are now, many of them, half of them at least, are dead now because they didn't do the right things.
It's fascinating. David, I get the benefit of talking to a lot of fascinating people on my show, and I've started to notice a lot of them in their mid-70s that are absolutely crushing it right now. People like Graham Hancock was just here in my studio on Friday, Netflix series 72, Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad Poor Dad, he's like 75. Dan Pena, the $1 trillion man with a castle up in Scotland, 77. Jim Rickards, all these people. My mom is crushing it pretty good in her mid-70s. And, they've done the right thing. And it's almost, David, like they're in their prime. Another 20 years of this, they could add more to the world than the previous 70 years of their life. It's like they've got their IP dialed in. They got their audiences. They've got everything going. And in the past, they might have a few more years left, and then whatever, they would break their hip or they would start to get senile, and then we wouldn't hear from them again. And I'm just imagining what a great world this would be if they could keep cranking that into their 90s. It would be an asset. And I guess this is the question you get a lot is, aren't all of these old people going to be a liability to society? Or can they be assets?
Oh, they can certainly be assets. When you look at my father, he's helping raise the grandkids. He's contributing to the community. He just recently retired after he started up a new career in his 70s. This is going to be the future where someone who's in their 70s and 80s is still considered someone who's very hireable, who has a lot of wisdom, who can educate the young people. We have to change our attitude to someone who's 70 and 80. You can be starting a new career in your 80s now, and that's a normal thing. And we shouldn't look at our parents and our grandparents as guides to how our lives are going to be. Every year that we stay alive, we get another 3 months of life. And that's not even with these age reversal technologies that are just around the corner. So what I think is that it's going to be normal to be in your 90s and still playing tennis with your grandkids and working actively like the people you mentioned. It's going to be increasingly common. Now, if we look at the previous generations, let's take the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. People in her generation, only 2% of them made it to 100. Children and kids in their 20s today, half of them are going to make it to 100.
Half.
And that's just if you draw a straight line. I think we're going to have an exponential increase in longevity given the technologies that have just been discovered. So at least half. I think it could be the majority of people in their 20s today are going to be healthy into their hundreds.
And you just said for every year you live, you get an extra 3 months of life. You just said that real quickly. What do you mean by that?
Well, we're just extrapolating over historical trends. And it's really a straight line over the last 150 years. The increase in longevity because of medicine, technology, improvements in nutrition are guaranteeing us extra 3 months of life if you stay alive for another year. And that's been the trend for this length of time. So that's a guarantee. The cool thing is that with these developments, both technologically in how we can measure ourselves and predict disease, as well as prevent it with medicines and supplements and lifestyle, it's going to be 4 months for every year we live, 5 months. Eventually, where things get interesting and where we are with mice now, is that for every time period you stay alive, you get an extra time period. So for us, every year we're alive, eventually we'll get another year of life. And that's when things get really interesting. And Brian, you brought out something that I didn't really tackle yet. And that is what happens when people are living over 100? What happens to society? And that's a whole section of my book. As you know, the last third of the book is about what does that world look like? And I actually collaborated with a couple of London economists who are at the top of their game. I'm just a biologist. But what we calculated was that the cost savings of having people live just an extra year of healthy life in the US is actually $86 trillion by doing that to the economy over the next few decades. And if you give people an extra 10 years of healthy life, then you are talking about hundreds of trillions of dollars in savings in healthcare and also the contribution back to the economy. So it's not that people are a burden to society, they actually give back and the economy thrives because these people are contributing, they're traveling, they're spending, they're educating, and the world then becomes a much richer, more luxurious and booming society, as opposed to what we do now, which is spend about 1/5 of our economy just on healthcare.
Yeah, that's staggering. I mean, every time you get your head around that, was it like 19% of GDP is on healthcare or something? It's just, and that's been going up like since 8%, I think, for the last couple of decades. I mean, yeah, that speaks a little bit subtly of what you're talking about here. And then last thing is population. We're seeing birth rates decline in most major countries now to where they don't have enough to actually keep the country growing. This has been happening in Japan for a long time, but now in Europe as well, many countries can't sustain population growth.
Exactly. And that's the good news, is that by doing this, by extending people's healthy lifespan, we're going to maintain the economies rather than having a declining economy. We're already seeing in Japan and even China, this decrease in fertility and birth rates is going to jeopardize their long-term viability. And we really need to solve it. And the only way to do that, besides improving fertility, is to keep people healthy and productive. And if, I argue it's not just a risk keeping people alive, it's actually an imperative. We have to do this to keep the world's economy going. Otherwise, we're going to be spending too much money keeping people alive in nursing homes, and we're not going to have enough people to fill the jobs that are required in the future. And so, otherwise we're going to have generations of people just looking after kids and grandparents and grandparents, and we just can't afford to have that. Already, you look at Japan, they're suffering for that reason. And fortunately, Japan has kept their elderly healthier. That was really the only way out of that issue. For the Western world, for the UK and the US, if we don't do something about this, what we call the gray tsunami, economically, we're going to be in real trouble 20, 30 years from now.
It also seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, like you said, if you've got someone with this, like literally a lifetime of intellectual property, connections, wealth, again, why not have them stay with us another 5 or 10 years? Like, the world can only be a richer place, as opposed to if you just locked all those people up somewhere and said they couldn't talk to anybody or died. You want them around because that adds to the economy, that adds to everything.
Right. Well, it's a tragedy every time somebody dies, whether it's a kid or an older person, because you're right. There's a huge investment in somebody's life, and when they're gone, we lose all of that. And there's a richness to society having older people who are around. Increasingly, CEOs are in their 60s and 70s, even 80s. And these are some of the best CEOs out there because they've seen the cycles of business, and they understand how to give people their greatest potential and how to hire the right people and build teams. There are some people who do stick around for too long. There are some politicians who I think, and many of us think, have gone past their prime. But on the other hand, what if we kept them young? Would they maintain their political views, or would they become more youthful in how they looked at the world? There's also something to be said for people's outlook. If people think that they're going to be around for another 30, 40, 50 years, then would they take better care of society and the planet? I think they would.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed as I've gotten older is that I just think more about the collective. I think more about humanity. I think more about, why we're all here, and less about me and why I'm here, if that makes sense. And I know when I watch people like Ray Dalio from Bridgewater, he distinctly says, when I was younger, it was about competing, and now it's my time to give back. And I can now notice that in myself. This is the most important thing for me right now, is to pass on this knowledge in a selfless way. And just imagine if we had a lot of people doing that later in the years, how that might change the whole world and the narrative. It's pretty fascinating. Or like you said, maybe if they felt more youthful, maybe that would delay a little bit. It's interesting how all this might work on your mindset.
Yeah, well, I use my father as an example of somebody who was pretty pessimistic about life. He's the human equivalent of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. And I know that any Brits listening would know that story very well. I was raised on that book by my grandmother. My father became more and more optimistic the older he got. And I think that if you stay healthy, that's what happens. You realize that we are part of something much bigger than ourselves. And especially if we become financially stable and we have our health, then what's left? It's all about community. It's about education, our legacy. And I find that myself. I've always been an educator, but the older I get, the more I realize what I want to leave behind are millions of people who have a better life, and leaders in science and industry that can carry on I pass the baton on to them and carry on this new wave of research into aging. And so, often I think what helps us is we think about what are we going to be most proud of when we're in our last days. And I think a lot of us believe that leaving behind a human legacy, these people who will carry on what we haven't been able to fulfill in our own lives, is the best way to have this legacy that I think a lot of us are striving for. We're all looking for meaning in life. We want to, I think many of us want to leave the world a better place than we found it. And if we don't achieve what we wanted to do in our lifetimes, the best way to do that is to leave behind those who can fulfill that.
Yeah. So I have two young boys. They're 5 and 6 years old, and they're a massive handful. They're like a bunch of bandits. And, I'm going to look at them differently now after talking to you, but I'm looking at two potential, not only 100-year-olds, but maybe 120-year-olds. I mean, this is a long time they're going to be on this planet for over a century, like turtles or something. And I'm just wondering, as a parent now, as opposed to say 100 years ago, do I raise them differently now? And also based on the knowledge that you put out in your book and your talks, what are things I need to know as a parent now in 2022 that maybe I didn't know or wouldn't know in 1922?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, Brian. So Lifespan was my first book. That is the textbook of why we age and then why we don't have to. My second book, which I'm almost finished writing the draft of with Matt LaPlante, my co-author, is the guidebook. What is it about the modern world that we can change in our own daily lives to essentially guarantee that we'll live another 30 years? And then the third book, which I haven't fully started writing yet, but I've got a lot of references to go back to, is, as parents, how do we raise our kids to guarantee that they live the longest life possible? And it turns out that this clock that I refer to, the biological aging clock, starts at conception. We can measure this. In my lab, we measure it all the time. We can measure thousands of people. I actually have a company that next year will provide a test that should be cheap and accessible. It'll be a mouth cheek swab. You just rub your cheek and send off the DNA, and they'll tell you how old you are biologically. If anyone's, can I mention the name of it, Brian?
Yeah,
I don't want to be too egregiously promoting this, but often people want to know. It's called Tally Health, one word, tallyhealth.com. And get on the list. There's about 250,000 people already signed up. So get on now.
Is that like short for telomere? Is that why it is?
No, it's more interesting than that. Telomeres are a very old and not as accurate way of determining your health. What we measure are the problems in your software, the scratches on your CD. Literally what it is it's chemicals that are accumulating on your DNA as you get older. And we measure those, and we can use machine learning to tell us how old you are biologically. We can see how many packets of cigarettes you've smoked, if any. We can tell you if you've been good in your life and how you compare on that curve to other people your age. And often people say, well, I don't want to know that number because I can't do much about it. But what we want to do is to provide people with the guide to be able to slow down and reverse that number. And increasingly, we are able to do that. And so even if you are scared of that number, and if you come out a little higher than you should, the good news is that you can act on that and get it back to average or even below average. I'm of the view that information is important in our lives. I measure myself daily. I have devices that I stick on my chest or wear on my wrist that measure me 1,000 times a second. And that information is important for me to make decisions about my life. And that's why this aging test that I am developing out of my lab at Harvard, I think is important to give everyone a credit score for their life. But it's not doom and gloom. Even though I can tell you how long you have to live based on that number, if you don't change your lifestyle, the good news is that everybody can change that trajectory. Everybody can slow their aging process. My father didn't start working on his health realistically and diligently until he was in his 70s. So it's never too late to start. And I think having that number that you can measure every month or so will give people inspiration to change their lifestyles and see what works for them and what isn't working.
I love that. And so you're telling me that, like, my boys, ever since conception, they're starting to age. That DNA is starting to break down based on every single choice they're making, which I guess is the choices I'm making as a parent, at least for their first few years or decade of life. And the third book will be kind of how to raise your kids, I'm guessing, to also give them the good habits that will probably take them on.
Well, yeah, that for sure. You definitely want to teach them the habits that are in the books that I write. On top of that, you can make sure that by the time they're in their 30s, they're biologically in their 20s still, by what you feed them, how you expose them to things like chemicals, radiation, even X-rays we found can accelerate the aging process. Exercise, of course, is very important. Type of exercise, the types of food they eat, when they eat, the amount of sleep they get, the amount of stress, psychological and physically, they get. And these are all things that are increasingly shown to affect their clock. And, let's take the extreme example. A child that's raised on ultra-processed foods, who doesn't ever exercise, who is obese, who's eating the wrong types of foods, who's not getting the type of chemicals from the plant world that we know can slow down aging, that child will accelerate. They will be older than a child that does all the right things. And I believe that's why we're seeing this massive growth rate increase in our children. Why are they bigger and often reaching maturity sexually faster than we did, and certainly faster than our parents did? That's because they're actually literally getting older faster.
Wow, that's scary.
And it echoes decades in the future, right? How we raise our kids will affect how healthy they are in their 60s and 70s.
Wow. Well, let's jump in, because now everyone's been waiting on how they can dial back their age and how they can try to become younger. And let's talk about some of these things. A quote from you is quite simply, you said, after 25 years of researching aging and having read thousands of scientific papers, if there's one piece of advice I can offer, one surefire way to stay healthy longer, one thing you can do to maximize your lifespan right now, it's this: eat less. Speak on this, David, because nobody wants to hear this. And every message we get all day long is the opposite of that message.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a disaster. The modern world, as we call it, is all about eating. And nutritionists have really many of them have done a really poor job in making us live longer. The old idea, and even the current idea for many nutritionists, is don't be hungry. Eat lots of little meals. Make sure that you're always fed. And so we live in a world now where breakfast is, quote unquote, the most important meal of the day. Turns out that's an advertising campaign. That's not based on science. You want to have a snack mid-morning, don't be hungry. Have a lunch, snack in the afternoon, have your protein bar, then have a dinner. Then you might even snack late at night. This is the recipe for having a short lifespan. You might feel good, but the problem is what you're doing is you're never letting your body go into adversity mode. And the genes that protect us against aging and diseases of aging are suppressed by our lifestyle. So when I say eat less, I should have really said eat less often, because I eat the normal amounts of food that I should for someone my age. I maintain my weight. I'm not getting thinner. We don't want malnutrition. We don't want starvation, for sure, especially in our kids. But what I want to do is to have an eating window of time that's not spread out through the day. And so what I try to do is I try to skip breakfast, have a very small amount for breakfast. I have a little bit of yogurt. And then I try to go as long as I can drinking a lot of hot tea. I have right here next to me a lot of beverages. I drink thick green tea matcha. I finished that one. I drink beverages that don't have a lot of calories, have no sugar in them, but will give me the nutrients that I need during the day. I don't get hungry. And then I eat a really enjoyable large dinner to pack in my calories into about 2 to 3 hours. That's my eating window. Now, if I get hungry, I'll eat a little bit of sugar-free chocolate or some nuts. I'm not so strict about it. If I'm hungry, I will eat a little bit. But I try to pack it in. But don't try to do that tomorrow. If you're a 3 meals and snacks kind of person, start with trying to skip one meal or eat a smaller amount and get your body used to it. It turns out your body can make its own sugar. Your liver does what's called gluconeogenesis. It makes its own sugar. You can measure it. If you want to get a glucose monitor and slap it on your arm, by all means do that. And you'll see that over 2 weeks of doing what I'm telling you, your liver will get used to it and start making its own sugar. So instead of having these super high spikes of blood sugar and then deficits, and then you get the brain fog and the hunger, and then you eat again, and it's this cycle of too much sugar and not enough sugar in your body. That's the current existence of most people. It's horrible. I go through the day not feeling hungry, not having any brain fog. I have lots of focus, lots of brain energy, lots of physical energy through the day. And that's a much better way to live. And the good news is that if you do what I'm telling you, science says that your body will fight aging far more than if your body's always just in this abundance mode.
This is such an important point to make. And the reason we eat so often is because of marketing. Right. It's this entire marketing campaign that we grew up in. You're in the States right now. It's even worse there. You know, eating is worse there. Portions are massive. Food is everywhere. I grew up in California, and in America, in a weird way, you almost measure the man by the size of his food. There's a really weird relationship with food in that country, and I think we're starting to see it in a damaging way in obesity levels. But I had a guest on my show who had just come off of a very long fast. I think he had just come off like a 20-day fast, and he came to talk to me about it. His name is Timothy Sheaf, and I basically decided to do a 48-hour kind of water fast on the back of it. First time ever. And I did it. And David, one of the things I realized was when I went to grab or a piece of food or a drink or something, I soon realized that urge had nothing to do with calorie deficit, had nothing to do with nutrition. It was a habit I had picked up, just like a dopamine habit, to pull out my phone when I was bored or to do something like that. And I realized once I got over that, I felt fine. I felt great. Everything was okay. I just had to resist this urge that I had. It just made me feel better is all it really was. And again, I went the whole day and a half, whatever. You go to sleep one night, you don't eat all day, you go to sleep the next night. And I learned a ton about myself, of just my own psychology of my triggers to eat. And I wouldn't say I was on the bad end of the spectrum either. I don't know. Does this sound familiar? Some of these reactions?
Yeah, it really does. And I'm not a David Goggins. I'm a David Sinclair. And David Sinclair is pretty lazy. He likes food. So if I can do this, anyone can, seriously. So what I do is, first of all, I ask myself, am I really hungry? Or am I just bored or stressed?
Yeah.
That's the first question. And usually, like you say, I'm just bored or stressed. I'm not really hungry. But if I am hungry, what I then do, or even if I'm stressed, I'll reach for something liquid rather than solid. So here I always have some water around or something hot. I'll make a tea. I definitely give my kidneys a run for their money. Put a bit of lemon in there, a bit of monk fruit sugar or stevia if I like sweetness. Think about beverages. Focus on beverages, not sugar beverages, but anything but. But that's what gets me through the day. It's, we're mammals. We like to put stuff in our mouths. It's just a habit of ours. But it's fine. I think that you need to substitute something. I wouldn't say try to never put something in your mouth. Just substitute, put something that you can chew on. It might be, I'm not a big fan of chewing gum, but if that helps, if it's sugar-free gum or something else, a little bit of sugar-free chocolate, as I mentioned, those things.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website, londonreal.tv, or click the link in the description below.